Hello and welcome to the Becoming Your Highest Self podcast. I'm your host, Macy Renee, and we are going on a journey together, my friend. If you've been looking for a podcast geared towards your growth, self-awareness, navigating your brain's daily mind drama, and deep inner work to become your highest and best self, you are in the perfect place. Let's get started. Hello. Welcome back to another episode of the podcast. Welcome. If you're brand new here, I'm so excited to have you, and welcome back if you come every week. So I'm just going to give you the down low on this episode. I am sitting in bed. I am going to record this and come from the most raw, vulnerable place. So the way that this came about, this is not typically how the podcast goes. So I just want to tell you that if you are new here, you're entering a very vulnerable episode. Whereas if you're kind of here to figure out what the gist of the podcast is overall, then maybe go back to some of the other episodes. But I felt very called to record this today. So if you don't follow me on Instagram, first of all, what are you even doing if you're on that platform? My handle is at Macy Renee Coaching, which is newer. So if you look at how you can connect with me in the show notes, especially like if you go back to the beginning episodes, that handle has since changed. It used to be Macy Renee _. Now it's Macy Renee Coaching. So each week on Instagram, what I've started doing is a Monday quiz to help people get to know me better. So basically, I put up pictures and, about 5 different quiz questions. That way my audience can start to get to know me a little bit better. And so it's actually the second time that I have done this. So it's still very new, but it's something that I've really grown to enjoy. So this morning, I was kind of racking my brain with, like whenever you're in a circle and people say, okay, tell us something about yourself. And your brain kind of goes blank because you're like, what am I going to tell these people about myself, or what would I want someone to know? I used to hate that in school, by the way, when teachers would be like, let's go around in a circle and say something unique about yourself or say something random about yourself. I used to hate that because I could never think of something cool that I could do that maybe nobody else could do, or what this, rare quality was about me. So anyway, sometimes coming up with the quiz questions is still kind of hard because I want them to be fun and simple enough for people to get them, but, throw in a complicated one every now and then. So anyways, I was listening to music and I was thinking of these questions, and I was kind of scrolling through my phone, and I stumbled across my notes on my iPhone. And while I was listening to this particular song, I don't know about you guys, but there are people who listen to music for the words and the lyrics. And there are people, I think, that listen to music for the beat and the sound and the vibration that it activates in your body. And I am that one. I listen to music, and the first thing that I notice is never the words. So it's very interesting because my husband is a lyrics guy. Every time he wants me to listen to a song, he'll start to play it, and then he'll start talking over the song, and he's like, did you hear that lyric? Did you hear what he just said? Did you hear what she just said? You hear how powerful that is? Do you see the connection? And he's just so engulfed in the lyrics, which I think is how most people's brain operates, I feel like. And mine never goes there. A lot of times I don't even hear the lyrics, as crazy as that sounds. I feel the vibration in my body, and I know almost within 15 seconds of a song if I love it or if I don't, because of how it makes my body feel. I'm very much a feeler versus someone who, listens to the words and music. So if it's got a great beat, if the vocals are very powerful and strong, or there is uniqueness to someone's voice, that is what makes me love a song more so than the lyrics. Now, that's not to say that I don't love the lyrics, but I'm likely to listen to a song 10 to 15 times because I love the beat. or, the way that it sounds, and then find the lyrics on YouTube and figure out what they're saying. So that's kind of how my brain works. So anyways, I was listening to it's Bloody Samaritan by Loud Urban Choir. The long version remix on YouTube is what I was listening to. And there's something about that song. It's also trending as like a reel on Instagram and probably TikTok and stuff. But there's something about that song that just sends me, I don't know, it just feels really good into my body. Anyways, while doing so, I was scrolling on the notes section of my phone and I came across an old note that I entered in 2013 that I knew before I even read it that if I read it, I was going to cry. Because I remember the last time I read it to my middle sister. We were standing in her apartment and my husband was also there, and I was hesitant to read it because it's so vulnerable, and I feel like I'm going to cry right now. So I'm just going to warn you that if holding space for someone is still very challenging and you find yourself triggered by other people's emotions, again, this might not be the podcast for you, but I am going to crack myself open. I am going to be super raw in the moment. Like, I haven't spent a lot of time thinking about how I want to say what I want to say. It's just going to come out and it's going to be the most vulnerable, real rawness that I can give you. I'll probably want to crawl under a rock and hide when this episode releases, knowing people are going to hear it in the flesh. So right now it doesn't feel as hard as it's probably going to feel when you all are actually listening to it. So anyways, I read through it and I just could not get through it. I cry every time, and I'm going to read it to you on today's podcast episode. And really the basis of this episode is going to be how healing is not this linear experience. I think that we think when you start doing the work, right? When you start going to therapy, when you hire a coach, when you start reading the personal development books, I think the expectation is I'm going to get to a place where I feel good all the time, where I don't have emotions, where I'm not going to feel sad. And if I do feel sad, something's wrong with me. It means I'm not managing my mind, or it means I'm not managing my emotions, or whatever. And that is not the case. Healing is this lifelong journey, I really feel like, where the ultimate goal is to come home to yourself through means of deep self-awareness and a constant state of learning and a constant state of just, understanding and grace and love for yourself, no matter how difficult or challenging things may be. And what I have found to be true in the 8 years that, I've been doing this work of really introspection, or just really looking at myself, it's been this messy roller coaster of a journey. There are periods of time where I'm doing really well with it and everything in my life feels really good and stable and it's great. And then there are times in life where something will come up and I will recognize pieces that still need work, that still need healing. And I think that that's a part of it. And I think that coaching kind of speeds up that process. So we hosted a dinner here last night with my husband's cousin and friend, and we got to talking about therapy and coaching, just because one of them had a question of what is your perspective of therapy, because here's my experience of it. And we kind of had similar experiences where, or perceptions I should say, where and I've shared this, my experience of therapy was, and I went for 17 years, was that it was great that someone was always listening to me and holding the space for me. But one thing that didn't move the needle so much for me like coaching did was the fact that in therapy, I was always justified in all of my thinking, really in all of my behavior, because I came from a traumatic background. And I think, maybe the climate has changed in therapy now. I don't really know. But I was always allowed to kind of stay in that victim mentality when I was working with therapists, because my background was so traumatic and I had experienced so many traumatic things that it was well, of course you feel that way. And of course, and it was always validating those very painful experiences, which I think was very valuable. P.S. I think that I needed that to not feel like I was crazy or, being overly dramatic or making things up. Because I think the tricky thing with trauma sometimes is that, when things are good, you start to question your own validity. Like you start to question your own mind. It's kind of like if you've been in a narcissistic, abusive relationship or domestic violence kind of relationship or something like that. Or, it's been messy with your parents and stuff like that. And maybe there's been like sexual abuse or something. It's like, that it's wrong and it's not normal and that you've been forever impacted by those things that you experience. But then when their behavior is good or when things are going good, your brain does this weird thing where it starts to question your own trust in yourself. Like, well, maybe I was making things up, or maybe things weren't as bad as they used to be. And I've talked to friends about this who have experienced, sexual trauma and things like that. And where they tried to tell a loved one and the loved one didn't believe them. And then they kind of started to question themselves, like, well, maybe it wasn't that bad. Like, maybe I was just being dramatic, and they kind of go through this story. And I've done that with my life and my childhood with, family members, where when things are really good with my family members, sometimes I'm like, why are you being so dramatic about, what your past was? It doesn't seem like it was that bad. You've probably been dramatic. So all of that to say, coming around to therapy, I think those 17 years where I went to therapy, talking it out and, hearing that I wasn't crazy and that of course I felt that way. And of course, that was helpful. However, the thing that actually moved the needle for me was coaching. And the reason being was because in therapy, I never had to take responsibility for any part of my trauma, any part of my thinking, any exploration of my actual feelings and how I have had some role in that. And coaching offered this whole different perspective of the suffering is optional. I didn't know that, all of this was optional and feeling horrible is optional or feeling great is optional. I thought that my past dictated how I was going to feel every single day for the rest of my life, and that if the people that caused the trauma didn't change, that I was going to be the girl with the bad, hand of cards, and nothing was ever going to feel better, or relationships were never going to get better. I was never going to be able to stop people pleasing. I was never going to be able to set boundaries. I was never going to have strong, loving relationships. I was never going to feel fully, good in my own skin. And the truth was, that was not true. And that's why this podcast even exists, because I want other people to know that the suffering truly is optional, and you don't have to choose that based on your past. But in order to shift your life, you have to be willing to lean into all of the discomfort of the healing process, including taking responsibility for the things that you're maybe holding on to stay in that victim mentality. And it feels like it's working, except if you're actually wanting the trajectory of your life to change, you know that it's not. So coaching just kind of helps speed up the process of, oh, okay, I'm still going to have emotions no matter what. I'm still going to have, maybe horrible thoughts or intrusive thoughts or, mean thoughts, every now and then, but I'll know what to do with them. It basically was like being handed this big toolbox of like, here's what you do when, and here's how to navigate this. And that toolbox is really what changed my life, because it was no longer me just having to talk it out and wait till the next session. It was like, okay, here's a list of things that's going to actually help you feel better and know what to do when you feel like trash. Because guess what? In life, you're going to keep feeling like trash. Life coaching is not the solution to not feel like trash. Life coaching is the solution to know how to take the trash out and how to navigate it when it comes back up, right? If something comes back up or somebody pulls something back out from your pile of trash, it's not this mega life-altering thing. You kind of know what to do. So maybe a little bit of a crazy analogy, but that's kind of how I think of it. So this morning after I read that passage, I just was like beside myself in tears, and I let myself have those tears and cry it out and feel the feelings. And I went on my Instagram and I posted my quizzes, which people are still answering now because it's Monday and I'm recording this a whole week in advance. And so I was in my feelings and I'm like, you know what? I'm going to talk about this. I'm going to talk about the healing process and share a little bit more about my story, parts that maybe some of you don't know, which I know to be true because you're missing the quiz question. So, this whole situation is regarding family that I do not have a relationship with. So, something that you all have probably never found out about me because it's not something I air on a public platform because it's sometimes painful. It's not that it's a secret. Like, if somebody came to me and asked me questions, whether in my inbox or in person, I would tell you everything. I am truly an open book. If someone asks a question, I'm going to be honest. That's just who I am. I'm not going to, like sugarcoat it. I'm not going to beat around the bush. I'm going to give you a direct answer. I have no problem sharing my entire story with people who ask questions. But to share my story when it hasn't been prompted or asked for is harder because I try to be respectful of everybody's privacy because my story includes other people, right? So I try to be mindful of that when I'm sharing, in that I don't want to ever hurt other people because that's never, ever the intention. So the dance that I've been doing for years, and something that I got coaching on actually for like 2 years, maybe longer with my coach, was seriously learning how to share my story and not completely trash my relationships with the people who were involved in my story, because it was kind of like, how do I share my truth, my experiences, and not feel like this hushed, wounded girl, right, that has to be quiet until everybody dies to protect them, because that's truly how it felt. It's like, this sounds so bad, but like, I would love to even write a book one day, but my brain goes, in order to write a book, you're probably going to have to wait for everybody to no longer exist, because people are going to be really mad at you if you share parts of your story, because the parts of your story that were painful to you involve other people who would probably want the world not to know those things. And so that has been a very painful experience as well, in learning like my boundaries with, there are certain things I'm going to share because that's part of my healing process and my truth, but there are also pieces that I will keep in the quote unquote closet publicly until I learn a graceful way to say it that doesn't, take away your privacy or whatever. So that's been its own little dance that I've had to do. But something that people probably don't know about me is that I actually have several siblings. So what you see in the media, talking as if I'm this famous person, I'm surely not. But what you all see a lot of times is the relationship I have with my sisters. Now, technically, they're my half sisters. They're my mom and stepdad. Those are their kids. But I've never, ever thought of my sisters as my half siblings. You know what's so crazy is that growing up, I mean, we're close. I'm really close with my sisters. And growing up, I never ever thought of them as half siblings. And I can remember the shocking day where a classmate of mine I think we were maybe in 5th grade. Yeah, I think 4th or 5th grade, where they pointed out that my sisters were my half siblings. And I was like like my spirit was devastated, because although like I knew that logically in a roundabout way, I've just never thought of them as only like half of me. You know what I mean? We're so close. It's like, no, they're like my full sisters. What are you talking about? Even though I'm like mocha colored and they're, they're very fair skin. It's like, no, these are my full blown sisters. What are you talking about? So I've never even thought about it that way. But when I was really young, so I have a different dad, and I don't have a relationship with my biological father, and that's in and of itself its own painful experience for different reasons. But growing up, of course, as a little girl, like I had all the questions, right? And my story's complicated. If you've been here for a while, you know, like my mom got pregnant with me at 15 years old, had me at 16. She had an abortion. The abortion did not work. The abortion was because my grandparents didn't feel like she was ready to have a kid. So it wasn't my mom's choice. My grandparents felt that she needed to do that. And that was basically like, you're going to live under our house. You're going to follow our rules. You're going to have an abortion. And so she did. And the abortion didn't work. And you're listening to me on this podcast today because it didn't work. And growing up, that created a lot, I mean, it was just painful, right? It's painful for my mother. It's painful for my grandparents because they're Christians. So that's not something that they, like, to this day, I think that they regret choosing that. That's not what they believe. However, that at the time, my grandma always says, like, you don't know what you're going to do until you're placed in that situation. But it was painful for everybody. And it was painful for me as a kid because when they would have their fights about it, my mom being angry that, you know, my grandparents made her do it, and then I survived the abortion, and then they wanted me to they wanted me to be adopted. And then whenever that didn't work out, then obviously I was kept, but then I was raised by my grandparents and my mom didn't get to raise me. And so that created a lot of stuff, like just a lot of messiness in life. And so growing up, I heard, you know, I was present for all of those arguments. I was present for all of those fights. And I talk about on the podcast, your first 7 years of life, you're a sponge. You take in everything you hear, everything you see, and it becomes a part of your programming in your brain and a part of who you believe that you are because it's what you hear and what you're surrounded by. And every time this fight would come up, it always felt like I was unwanted. Now, I didn't discover that that's how I truly felt until I was an adult, exploring why my past felt the way that it did or why I was responding as an adult like a child. Like sometimes I would have these episodes as an adult feeling like I was a 5-year-old child stomping and screaming. So I actually have an episode of this. It's the one where I talk about how I invited, as an adult, a bunch of people to my house for a party, and then one by one everybody canceled, and they canceled for reasons like there's a blizzard coming, I live 2 hours away, it wouldn't be safe, and you know, I'm canceling because my kid is sick, and I'm canceling because of blah blah blah. All legitimate reasons, right? Not that they needed one, but all legitimate reasons. And I felt my spirit become crushed in this huge major way. And because I've done life coaching, I knew that it was not because people canceled coming to my party. I knew that there was something deeper underneath that. So because I've been equipped with the life coaching tools, I explored it, right, without going into like, woe is me. I explored it and really thought about it, and I realized that it was because from all of the stuff I would hear when I was younger, it made me feel unwanted. So when people didn't come to my adult party and told me no, I had the inner child tantrum of, I'm unwanted. Of course they're not coming to my party. Of course they're canceling. Of course not one single person is going to show up. I'm not even wanted, right? Now we know that that is not the truth, and that is not actually the case. However, when you have wounds and trauma that you haven't explored, your brain will offer you stories like that. And if you don't have the tools, that's what part of what keeps cycles going. And then a lot of times people will react from their emotions that have been unmanaged and unchecked, and then they will ruin relationships with people who really wanted to be there but ultimately couldn't. And then it creates like so much more drama in your life when you don't understand you. And that's why I preach coaching so much. I'm like, if you understand you and your reactions and where your reactions are coming from, your life will be a lot less painful. You will not suffer as much because you will be able to take radical responsibility before you create any damage. So the tools are, I will preach them till the day that I die, right? I will preach coaching till the day I die. And it is why I do what I do and what my life's purpose is. So I have half siblings, and I actually have 6. My mom and stepdad gave me my 2 sisters that I'm very close with. And then my dad, my biological dad, who I do not have a relationship with, to my knowledge at this point, has 4 kids ranging from 8 years old to, I believe, almost 29 years old, if not 29 years old. And I'm turning 31 here in a few months. So I actually became aware of two of those siblings when I was a kid, because as a kid, I think it's very natural, like if you don't know your full story, that you just start asking a lot of questions. And when I became around 8, 9, 10 years old, I asked a lot of questions. I wanted to know if I looked like my dad. I wanted to know qualities. I wanted to know my history. And I think that that's probably what is so painful for kids that don't grow up with their biological parents, whether you've been adopted or maybe you were fostered in many foster homes, or for whatever reason you just don't know your full story. I think that it's very, very painful. I know it's very painful being a living experience for me, but also I have a lot of clients that come to me and it's also very painful for them. We share a lot of tears on coaching calls sometimes because it is such a painful experience to navigate and work through. But as a kid, I asked a lot of questions. And so there was a whole situation with that. But long story short, I was able to reluctantly meet my biological dad when I was 12. And on my way to that meeting, I could hear on the phone my dad saying, like, I don't want to meet her. I don't want to meet her. I don't want to meet up with you guys. I don't want to meet her. I don't want to know her. And so it was this very painful experience of, hearing firsthand, like I'm, again, feeling that unwanted story, right? I'm unwanted. He doesn't even want to come. Why are we doing this? It's a big secret, right? It was this whole situation. And so it felt very, very painful. But we did end up going through with it, and I met him, and my question was answered as far as, like, who do I look like? I felt like I looked a lot like him, aside from the fact that I had my mom's freckles and all the things. But at that meeting, I learned that I had two brothers at the time. And I was 12, and I learned that I had a brother that was 10 and a brother that was 8, okay? And I was told their names. And so that stuck with me forever. And from that point forward, I would have dreams of meeting them. I would have nightmares of meeting them. I would wonder all the time as a kid, I wonder if we've ever been in the same store. I wonder if we've ever been at the same park and played in the same vicinity and never knew each other. Like, this is where my brain would go as a kid all the time. I would see kids that were maybe like the same skin tone as me, and I would just wonder. I'd be like, oh my gosh, I wonder if that's them. I wonder if I'm ever going to run into them one day. I wonder if I'm ever going to see them one day. And so it was like this fantasy in my mind that just played all the time. So fast forward, my husband and I start dating, and it's no surprise that we start dating. I often talk about how trauma attracts trauma. If you're unaware, you attract the person in your life that's on the same wavelength as you. And at that time, my husband and I were 17 years old, and we connected because when we got to the deeper stories of who we are and out of the surface level stuff, my husband shared how he had, several siblings that he had never met before. And I had been holding all of this in for most of my life. It wasn't ever something that I wanted to talk to my siblings about or my family about. Like, I just held it all in. And so my husband was that safe place and that person that understood. And we bonded over that. Like, okay, we both have very painful things that we need to work through. Now, that's been both a beautiful thing and some of our biggest work in our relationships, because when you attract through traumatic things, guess what happens whenever you're triggered from said traumatic things? You usually have arguments that come about, or very hard conversations to navigate, because it's a sensitive button for both of us. So we've had to learn how to communicate through painful things we're experiencing because of our past. So that's kind of, maybe that's the podcast episode I also need to do. I think I've briefly talked about it, but maybe I need to talk about it again. So all of that to say, my husband and I would talk all the time about, like, what if one day we met our siblings? What if one day we knew them? And when I started college, I had this very, like, I was in the worst year of my life, my first year of college. Literally felt like nothing else could go wrong. And then one day I got a message from a name that sounded familiar. And as soon as I saw the name, I had the flashback of the moment I was sitting in the car meeting my biological dad, and it clicked for me. And I realized that the person that had friend requested me was one of my siblings. And I was in shambles. I don't think that I accepted it maybe for several hours, if not a few days, because it felt like my world was spinning in that moment. And it was this feeling of excitement, but also this feeling of like, I wonder, like, again, my brain was like, I wonder if they know. I wonder if they, like, do they know that we're related? Is this that person? So I was looking at, it's my brother. So I was looking at his photos, and I was like, crap, we do look a lot alike. Like, I wonder if he even knows. So I accepted it. I got myself to accept the friend request, and then I didn't hear anything. 2 weeks later, I have a message in my inbox, and that message is basically like, hey, I know that this is going to be really awkward. So keep in mind, like, I'm 18 at the time. So this brother is like 14 years old at the time. And he is like, hey, I know this is going to sound really awkward, but did you know that we're related? And I I remember crying when I read that message and saying, "Yes, I know. I've known about you guys since I was 12." And he responded, he's like, "We just found out about you about a week ago." And it opened the door where all of a sudden several people from my dad's side started friend requesting me on social media, but never my dad. And at the time, 18, literally in the worst year of college in my life for multiple reasons, that this was like the cherry on top. And I just didn't have the capacity for it. I was seeing a psychologist as well as a psychiatrist for other things. And so this was like, let's add this to the session and just, stress my psychiatrist and psychologist out so much that they're going to need meds or someone to help them. So it was this big whole to do, and it was very stressful. And I remember at the time so many of my family members reaching out and being like, we'd love to meet you, we'd love to know you, and I just didn't have the emotional capacity for it. I was like, I just really can't. And after that moment, I always lived with this, am I going to regret this? Am I going to regret not knowing them, not trying, not, just, but at the same time I just really felt like I couldn't. So after that, my brain would always, again, go into fantasy mode. What if one day I run into them? What if one day I meet them? What would that day be like? Would we cry? Would we laugh? Would it be awkward? Would they hate me? Would they love me? Like, what would it be like? And it was just this, super emotional thing to think about. And my husband and I would have so many conversations around, what if one day we meet our siblings? What if one day, like, we accidentally run into them? And in my spirit, I always had this feeling that maybe I would. Like, from childhood, when I learned that they existed, I always had this feeling like one day I just feel like it's going to happen. And I really hope that I'm strong on that day. So fast forward to August of 2013. My husband and I were on a date at the Kentucky State Fair. And we were, navigating the crowd. There's there's the theme park, because we have a Six Flags Kentucky Kingdom in Kentucky. And then, the expo center and everything. So you can go around the whole expo center, and that's where like all the yummy food is, and, the expositions and all of that kind of stuff. And then there's the area right around Kentucky Kingdom where they set up the temporary rides. And so my husband and I were like, let's ride the Ferris wheel, So we decided to ride the Ferris wheel, and we get off the Ferris wheel. And there were thousands of people there, you guys. It was the weirdest thing, like thousands of people, and mostly teenagers. It's the place where like all the teenagers would go. So like Saturday night is bumping, Friday night's bumping, My husband and I are young, 20, like, see, I'm probably 21 or 22 at the time. So we get off the Ferris wheel, we're navigating the crowd. There's people buying candy apples and people playing all the games to win stuffed animal prizes, and there's a bunch of people around, thousands. Something in me had this feeling, and I glance probably 50 feet away from me, maybe 25 feet away from me, and I see my sibling. And it felt like my whole world stopped. Like it was so crazy. And so, of course, at that point, my brain is like, oh my God, do I even tell, at the time, my boyfriend, who's now my husband? I'm like, do I tell him? Do I let it go? Do I tell him when we get in the car? And I just knew that if I waited to tell my husband once we were in the car, that, he would be like, what? Why didn't you tell me? So I ended up, telling him, and we went through this whole experience, and I'm going to share that with you in just a moment. But after I left, I was just in shock for the longest amount of time. And I had some conversations with some of my best friends, my childhood best friends, about what it might be like, one day to meet them. And so after this experience happened, I texted one of my best friends, and basically after I texted it to her, I never wanted to lose that text message, so I put it in my iPhone notes. And today I found it for whatever reason, and when I read it, I always think that I can make it through without crying. I'll see if I can on this episode. Since I've already cried over it once today, I might make it through, but if I don't, I apologize. Actually, I don't apologize. I think it's so important to, you know, be raw and emotional and feel our feelings in the moment. I think sometimes that connects so deeply with other people, and a lot of times we feel like we can't do that. And I think that sometimes we feel like we can't do that because there are a lot of people in the world who don't know how to hold space. And that's why I teach this so heavily on the podcast, that when you're working through your own stuff, you create more space to hold for someone else who's trying to work through theirs. And that's what creates safety for us to be our authentic self. So it's like, if you are not surrounded by people working on themselves and knowing how to hold space for themselves as an individual, it's going to be very hard for them to hold space for you, and vice versa. So I'm going to read this. I'm obviously going to leave out names and change some things as I read it, so that way, privacy is respected. But I think you guys know maybe my husband's name. My husband's name is Cortez. And like I said, we've been together since we were 17, so I'll just leave his name in here. But this is the gist of the text message that I sent my best friend on August 25th, 2013. Cortez and I were leaving the Ferris wheel, and as we were walking through the crowd of teens where you enter the rides, I looked up and spotted him. I stopped so fast and felt my heart pounding and told Cortez, oh my God, there he is. Cortez freaked out and was asking where, looking in every direction, freaking out. I told him, he's directly in front of us. I don't know if I can do this. And Cortez was like, do you want to? I think you should, really. So I took a huge breath, shaking to death, and walked up to him and his girlfriend and said his name. He looked at me, and I could see the shock all over his face. He smiled, but I could tell his heart fell and pounded just like mine. I asked if I could have a hug, and he said yeah, and we hugged. I said, well, it's nice to officially meet you, I guess. And he laughed and said, yeah, I know. It was so awkward. I had no words at all. I could feel myself close to crying. I said to him, I'm sorry this is so awkward. It's an awkward situation. And he said, yeah, I know it is. I had said to him, I wondered if I would see you here tonight, but I can't remember what he said back. It felt so awkward that I then introduced my boyfriend Cortez, and they shook hands. Afterwards, I started to leave because I could feel my legs about to collapse. And then I said, let me give you my number. He smacked his pockets and said, I don't even have my phone on me tonight. And I said, okay, what if I give it to you on Twitter? He said, yeah, DM me on there. We hugged again, and I walked away. I literally made it about 6 to 7 steps with Cortez and just had to stop and cry. Cortez said, "Wow, that was so powerful. I'm glad I was here to witness that." He looked back at you too when you walked off. Your all's faces, I can tell. Your minds are spinning, and he's wondering how to even digest what happened as much as you. Plus, I think he's high. This part always makes me laugh. Okay, I gotta find my spot. He said, "But you were both a nervous wreck," and the look in his face said he knew exactly who you were. I cried more. My legs were shaking so bad that if Cortez was not hugging me tight in the middle of the fair, I would have fell. He could feel them trembling. It was just beyond emotional for me because I've had dreams of that moment. I've had dreams of meeting him and it being the best moment, and nightmares of meeting him and him rejecting me. So this was good, but there's no way on earth that wouldn't have been awkward. I feel good that it finally happened, but at the same time, it feels like a dream. Okay, I actually got through that way better. I think crying the first time I read it this morning on a whim was the emotional one. I couldn't even speak when I read that early. I couldn't even finish it. It took me, oh my gosh, it took me like 30-second pauses to gather myself. And I was snotting all over myself and crying all over myself because it just felt, when I read it for the first time this morning, after so many years of having not read it, it brought my body back to that moment, and it replayed out in my mind as if it was super fresh. So here is how I want to wrap this up. There will be things that you work on and you work on and you work on it and you work on it and you work on it. And then sometimes out of the blue, years later, something random can be brought up, or, it pops into your mind and it will make you emotional all over again. And it's okay. It's just another layer of something to work through sometimes. It's just sometimes acknowledging it. Like maybe your entire life you haven't really acknowledged it. You've shoved it down. And this time you have an opportunity to see it and let it be there and acknowledge it. For me, after that moment when I texted my best friend, I never really spoke to another soul about it. I didn't want my sisters to ever know for whatever reason. It felt scary. If I didn't want my mom to know, I didn't want my grandparents to know. So outside of my husband and I think one or two of my best friends, I just kept all of that in, and I shared about it through, therapy, but not anywhere else. And I didn't share this with my sisters until maybe 3 years ago, truthfully, after a lot of life coaching and stuff. And I still sobbed uncontrollably. My middle sister cried with me when I read it to her in front of my husband. I couldn't even get through it with her, and she was just as much in shambles. And, of course, said emotional things like, do you ever miss not having, here we go. Do you ever miss not having a relationship with them because you're so close to us? And like, what if they have kids? You're never going to be close to your nieces or nephews, So she was empathizing with the pain that is there. And so this is what I mean with the layers, right? I thought I would cry reading that. I didn't really cry. I could feel myself getting choked up. But here it is, the emotion coming up when I think about how, I'm an aunt. I know that they have had kids. And I think that there's a complicated, addition to that where you just grieve different parts at different times, and you don't really know how something is bothering you or why something is bothering you. And maybe it's not even that you want to change things. I think that's important to say too. It's like some people might listen to this and be like, well, why don't you reach out to them? Or are you still in touch? And why don't you just go meet everybody now that you've done all this work? But there's still layers and there's still complicated things. And it's not even that, I feel like I'm ready even to get to that point or process, but it's still okay to have the feelings as you're learning how to navigate it. And so the way that I've further processed this is by speaking up about it with my family. So I told my sisters about that experience for the first time a few years back. And I think it's because maybe they directly asked me, and I, finally said, yeah, I have met one of them and shared that experience. And then I eventually told my grandparents, and opened up about that, and again, sobbed thinking about that. Just it was really difficult opening up and being vulnerable. And then eventually I told, my mom about it. I didn't know how my mom was going to feel about it, or if it was going to trigger even her and some stuff from her past. And so I didn't want that either. And I think I noticed that in talking about it, it heals another layer time and time again, right? It's another piece that can kind of be laid to rest in a peaceful manner and not shoved in the locker of feelings as, I'm going to bury this and not face it. So, with this episode, I hope that you know that you're not alone in whatever things you're healing from or trying to heal from. And I want to encourage you that if you're in the stage where you just need someone to listen and you need to talk it out, keep going to therapy or seek out a therapist and someone that's going to listen and be able to help you, anything that you're going through from a professional lens, a licensed lens, especially if you feel like it has deeply impacted you in maybe a traumatic way and you need maybe, medication or a treatment plan. Like, if you're really wanting to stay focused on the past to try and work through that, then therapy might be the best route for you. But if you're trying to work through something, or you've been in therapy forever and now you're like, I want to lay this to rest and I want to feel peaceful about it and I want to know how to move forward and not keep revisiting the past. I want to be more future focused. I want to have a toolbox that, is really focused on my responsibility and what I can do. Then maybe coaching is the next step for you. I think that anything that you're doing to get yourself in a good mental health place that's a healthy way of coping is wonderful. And I'd encourage anybody to do that and to take care of yourself and your mental health. And, go do that for yourself, because a lot of times what limits us from our highest self and what limits us from our dream life and all of the things that we could ever want and truly achieving every desire placed on your heart, the thing that keeps us from having it is the unwillingness to become more self-aware and face our stuff, the unwillingness to feel the emotions that it requires to, go out there and do the scary thing or face the scary thing, say the scary thing, set the boundaries, stand up for yourself, step into your power, like whatever it is. So anything that you're doing in a healthy manner to take care of your mental health, I'm here for, whether that is therapy or finding yourself a coach, even if it's not me, right? Like I might not be everybody's cup of tea, and that's okay. But I do know that I am the biggest advocate for you to be doing your self-care, taking care of yourself, and really going after the life that you want, because I believe in the depths of my soul that you can go create whatever it is you want as soon as you're willing to look at your stuff. And if you feel like I'm the person that can help you with that, you can reach out and do a consult at MacyRenee.com. We'll figure out the best place to put you, whether that's one-on-one coaching or group. And I look forward to speaking with you and meeting you one day. Thank you for holding the space for me. Thank you for listening to my story. I really appreciate it. It's vulnerable. Probably going to be freaking out next week when you guys are listening to it. But that's okay. It's a part of the healing process. So thanks for being here, and I'll talk to you again next week.